Deputy Conley, finally.
Well, actually, thank you for coming, and I think most of the questions have been asked. But just, I think it might be the Controller and Auditor General. 6 severance payments were examined. Were they a sample of the severance payments, or was
well, they were larger ones. What was the total number?
Yeah, there were a number of cases, but we looked at those value in excess of 50,000. So
right.
There were others.
Yeah, they were the larger cases. All of the larger cases.
Okay. And are you satisfied that the Central Bank have implemented all of your recommendations like they've told us here today? And I welcome the fact that you're telling us that you've put them in place. Are you satisfied that they are now in place?
Yes, and I mean, obviously, in the future, if we see a significant severance payment, we will be looking at those, and we will be looking to see that the controls that are now in place were applied in relation to those. So I'm happy that the Central Bank have fully accepted what we suggested, and that the controls are in place, and we will keep under review that they're actually implemented.
Yeah. And just in relation to that, Mr. Quinn, just the best practice, I accept you've come here and I accept that you've complied from what the Controller, and I welcome that. I welcome that change. But when you talk about best practice not being there at the time, really it just sets off memories of the whole thing in Ireland with poor regulation, what led to the downfall in the first place. And unfortunately, ye as a central bank have a particular onus on you to lead. You're there to regulate, and in fact in your own mission statement, I'm not here to preach, but there's an extra onus on you to lead and to have best practice, and yet the bank aims to ensure that regulated firms are financially sound and safely managed, and so on and so forth. So I mean, if you're in that role, there's an extra burden on ye to do it right 100%. So my final question, if the report of the Controller and Auditor General wasn't before us, what internal sort of self-analysis or mechanisms had ye to highlight problems and change them?
Well, we're constantly reviewing all of our processes, not just in HR, but right across the operations in the organisation. That's part of the role that we carry out in terms of continually trying to improve. We have an internal audit area that also is there to support us in identifying any issues. We've robust risk management processes to manage operational risk. So if you look at the model, if there are deficiencies in a particular business area, then we expect them to be picked up by our risk management processes or ultimately our audit processes. But the primary aim is to ensure that the standard that you have outlined, Deputy, is the standard that we aspire to, and that's what we're working to. But this is a process of ongoing renewal within the organisation. We recognise our role. We recognise that we have to have standards that match the role that we perform generally in the regulated sector.
But the only thing I'd say about that, Mr. Quinn, is the period under examination is 11th to 13, is it? 11th to 13. So I would have thought you would have looked at that yourselves prior to a report coming before us and put these measures in place yourselves if your internal process is that robust.
And I think
they've been put in place now as a result of the Controller and Auditor General's report.
They're being put in place as a result of the Controller and Auditor General report.
Yeah.
Also, however, some of those improvements, as Liz has outlined, were put in place for exactly the reasons that you've outlined. The revised probation policy wasn't in itself a direct consequence of the Controller and Auditor General. It was our analysis that if you have a 12-month probation policy, that certain issues were not emerging and that the focus on performance wasn't strong enough in relation to that. So that, for example, was put in place ahead of 2011. So we put a full performance management system in place, as I've outlined earlier on, very early days in terms of 2011, to ensure that we had a methodology and a structured way of assessing performance within the organisation. So it's not that we don't look at how we operate. It's not that we don't look at the risks that we operate and put improvements in place. We do. In these particular circumstances, which I acknowledge when you look at them now, the issue of ad hoc individual severance payments arising, each of which in its own right are unique and complex. The fact that there was no central guidelines issued from the department, in that respect, we did not have the best practice guidelines there. We have them now and we'll operate to them.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Finally, before